Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm fired up about the guests that we have, and we have great guests. But today is a superstar guest. And if you're watching TV and streaming shows right now, especially when it comes to dramas, there is a show on CBC and on Fox Network that is hot, 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 and that is Diggstown. And so today, I'm so pleased to talk to the creator and writer for Diggstown, but also someone who's from Nova Scotia, went to law school here, did his undergrad here, is very connected to the community. And he really unpacks for us what happened with him throughout his life that led to him creating such a great series that people are eating up right now. So today, I'm pleased to welcome Floyd Kane. Hey everyone, welcome once again to Empathize Others, the podcast. Today's episode is one I've been creating and trying to get together for a long time. The guest is someone who is probably one of the biggest guests that we've had on the podcast so far. And to me, I'm a little starstruck because, this is someone who, I've been really watching the work that they're putting out in the community work. And although we're both African Nova Scotian and we have connections, which we'll talk about, when it comes to filmmaking, this person is doing big things in Canada and the US. And if you haven't heard of the series Diggstown, Marcy Diggs, lawyer from this Halifax, Dartmouth area, you've been under a rock, because that show is one of my favorite shows. And from, many people have told me it's one of their favorite shows. So today we're pleased to welcome to this platform, Floyd Kane.
Hey, thanks, Augy. Great to be here.
No word. Listen, Floyd, I'm so happy to get some time. And I know that you were here recently, then you're back, you move around. That's what you do. But it's nice for me to get a little bit of time with you. The podcast really focuses on community, right? And there's always an angle around why is community important to you. So we always kind of start off with, can you talk a little bit about where you're from, what community you're from, and we'll start there.
Sure. I'm from East Preston, Nova Scotia. I was born and raised there. My whole entire family, my grandparents, my great grandparents. Going back several generations. Where I grew up is essentially, if you look at the Queen's Grant at the Registry of Deeds, it's called the Kane subdivision. So I grew up, my community was essentially this gigantic extended family that I have.
Wow, that's there's what a historical connection. And we know as African Nova Scotians that we have a history that goes back hundreds of years, right? And we often say that in Canada when people say, "Where are you from?" They see you in Toronto, Montreal, they say, "Are you from Barbados? Are you from Trinidad? Are you from?" And we're like, "No, we're from Scotia." Like we're, so when you link your community, Floyd, to almost like a loyalist deed, right? Of that far back. That really speaks to your sense. So growing up, did you realize that you were part of that East Preston, Kane, Thomas community?
100%. My whole life, I think for me, like that community, because when I was growing up, there was no Metro Transit, right? There was the one bus that went in at 11 o'clock and came back out at 6 o'clock. And if you missed it, you were hitchhiking home. So that community as a child, that was very much my world, right? Like even in terms of elementary school, like I went to elementary school in East Preston at Partridge River Elementary, and the white kids were bused into our school. So it was a very different experience than a lot of other people had, right? And so then it wasn't until I think grade 5, where during the summer Partridge River had burned down and they built a new school at Bell Park
Yeah.
Academic Center, and we were bussed up into that school. And that was sort of the introduction of, like, a larger, worldview, should I say.
Yeah, that integration, and we often talk about this, Floyd, on this podcast around community. When you don't know anything, your community is just your home. Like and especially when you talk about pre-metro transit going out the highway, you were at home a lot, and you're around your family, you're playing with your cousins, you're playing with your sisters and brothers, and that is your community. And then sometimes the first realization, and then you say Partridge River was in your community, so you don't realize the difference, and that other people are not really from your community and might not get along with your community and might look down on your community. You probably don't realize that until you go to that first integrated school, right?
100%. 100%. I mean, like, the way I grew up was very, I mean, it was different probably from the norm, but it wasn't different from, I think, a lot of people in the Black community during the time that I was growing up, which would have been in the 70s, 80s. We didn't have running water. Like,
Yeah.
we didn't have running water until I was 14.
Wow.
My dad was, we lived in a 4, room, uh, like, shingle house. Like, our house was made of shingles on the outside, right? And we had like 4 rooms inside the house. I mean, we had a wood stove where there was a hole cut in the gyprock so that you could actually get the heat from the wood stove, which burned, throughout the night, into the back rooms where we slept. I mean, it was a very uh, basic growing up. I mean, to this day, that's one of the reasons why I don't really have any large desire to go camping because I feel like that's how I grew up, right? So, yeah, it was a different, you know, it was a very different experience than a lot of certainly my white peers growing up, and definitely, people who were from the city.
Yeah, that's a great point, Floyd, because we think about Halifax, and people that don't know Halifax, a lot of our Black communities are basically rural. So if you look at Hammond's Plains on Park Rock Road, you look at East Preston, North Preston, Lucasville, Cherry Brook, and Cherry Brook like all of those places, even though they're in the HRM, they're pretty much in almost country rural settings. And so we grow up as that's what it means to be Scotian. Like we're a little bit country and we're a little bit urban, and we kind of got a mix of the two. And so take us now. So now you're gone to high school, and I'm sure. So where did you go to high school?
I went to Cole Harbour High.
Okay, I taught at Cole Harbour. I love Cole Harbour.
Yeah.
So now Cole Harbour is unique, and I want to bring that up because you talked about um, going to a different elementary school, Bell Park, and then Cole Harbour is one of the only schools where local students don't really go to Cole Harbour. Some of them do, but you have Eastern Passage bust in, you have North Preston bust in, East Preston bust in to this school. And so, what was the next level from Bell Park to your sense of community once you got to high school?
I think it was interesting, right? Like, I mean, I'm somebody who I never, to my benefit and detriment, I was never a joiner in terms of I wasn't part of one group. I kind of glided through several different groups as I went through high school. I was pretty
Yeah.
much alone, kept to myself. Um, I would say that for me, I think definitely what you had that was different from the Bell Park experience was you had a group of Black kids and a group of white kids, both both communities like impacted by poverty, who had no experience being around each other.
Good point.
And I think I think because of that, there was just a battle for turf, for ownership, for space. And I think that all of that, presented as it should, as it became about race, because I think there just was a sense that, how can you hurt, like, what it is when kids are trying to hurt each other, you go for the thing that they know, they try to find the touchiest point. And I
Yes.
think for a lot of us, the touchiest point is race. I mean, I have people who can say a lot of things to me, even as an adult, but the moment that you say something that is racist, it's like we're having a conversation that may lead to like something more, because that's just, it's that painful, right? And people know that. So I think a lot of that happened at Cole Harbour, and obviously when I went there, it culminated in the fight that happened
Yeah.
back in 1989.
The infamous.
Yes, the infamous.
Yeah, and that was, but it's funny you bring that up, Floyd, because I taught at Cole Harbour, probably a decade after that, and at the time the remnants of there were still there. So the school was still early in, early out. Sonny Wicks was the full time security officer. That there's no other school that had that. But
Yeah.
it's interesting that you bring up community, because that fight was amongst adults to a certain extent. I mean, there was some school presence, but there were people who were from Eastern Passage, people that were from the Preston that came because similar to, and I work at the Department of Ed now, and we deal with this a lot. Like when one of our students feels that there's a racial incident, the whole community's in on it. Like the parent groups are there. And so those incidents would seem singular. They're not like bullying, like it's a singular thing. It's a
Mm.
community thing. And so what happened during that, what they might call the riot or whatever at Cole Harbour, was that the two communities, it boiled over and it became something bigger than just the school.
Well, in my opinion, I feel like it was always something bigger than the school,
Good point.
right? Like I think that like, to me, like I always had questions about why the kids who grew up on Lake Major Road on the other side of the bridge were never bused into North Preston to go to elementary school, right?
Good
Like
point.
like why is the Nelson Winder Elementary School only 0 to 4 as opposed to 0 to 6? Like
Yes.
it's just, to me, like, just, there are all of these questions about why we, and when I say we, I mean the powers that be, set up geographically and systemically, they set all of this up to fail. And to
Yeah.
this day, like they've never really corrected it. I mean, I'm still, and I'm jumping ahead a bit, but it's like when I came down to do Across the Line, I think it back in like 2016, 2014, I was talking to a friend of mine at the Department of Education, and they were telling me that the university numbers for multi-generational Black Nova Scotians were the same as when I graduated from high school. And that was shocking to me. And I think that's, like, for me, those are the fruits of the powers that be setting up a system, the kind of system that we set up,
Well, yeah,
right?
and you speak to systemic racism, really, Floyd, because it's not a one thing. But we look how Sir Robert Borden is set up, and Nelson Winder is set up, and Graham Creighton, and there's
Yeah.
things that are being done in the way that you're integrating some schools and some not, that are leading to, you bring youth together and adolescents that have never been together, and expect that they're not going to, like you say, fight for territory and not really get along. And also, Cole Harbour is an example of busing in kids that don't even live close to each other at all, right?
I
And so
know.
that's it. So brings me, and I'm thinking every time we do this podcast, Floyd, there's a beautiful kind of theme or threading of one thought as a kid, as a teenager, leads to you as a young adult, leads to you as an adult. So there seems to be a mix of artistic creativity and law equity. So as you go to St. Mary's, is that a good call that you were kind of still that artistic person, but there's something about equal rights and fairness that was also mixed into that? So talk about going to university and does I'm kind of hearing that. Does that make sense?
It's an interesting question, just because I feel like the big thing when I think about equity and I think about my university years and my high school years, like a lot of my feelings around the topic of equity were formed by the fact that when I was in grade 11, I got a job working at the IGA in Micmac Mall, and I was the first Black male they hired as a car pickup boy at the time. That was what we were called. The people who put your groceries in the trunk of your car. And when I started, the day that I started, and I'll never forget this. So I'm being taken around by this guy, and he's introducing me to everybody in this, like all the people who are in the store as a new person. And he tells this French Canadian woman who works in the produce department, Giselle, that my name is Kunta.
Ooh.
And they think it's the funniest joke, right? They think it's just such a funny joke. And I just remembered, and I didn't find this out till later on, right? Like I remember just thinking when I found out, I'm like, okay, that's Nova Scotia. That's to be expected, right? Like this, because I mean, I've been dealing with a lot of this, like racism and whatnot, in the various forms in my entire life. But I'm in grade 11, right? So, and this is really the first time I'm spending a great deal of time outside of my community. So it's just it's this weird thing, right? And then, of course, I later on, the biracial woman who she works in the deli department, she comes out to see me in car pickup, and she proceeds to tell me about the conversation that preceded me being hired, which in the conversation was essentially to the head cashier, why don't you ever hire any Black guys to work the front? And essentially after this conversation happened, I got the call. And the reason I got the call was because the head cashier happened to know my mother, who worked at Zeller's. Now, prior to this time, I had come into IGA, dropped off 3 job applications, and I was later told that essentially when a Black guy came in to apply for the job, the applications were thrown in the garbage. So for me, knowing all of this stuff, it feeds into it makes me more cynical about fairness and objectivity, right? When it comes to how we're treated in the workforce at a very young age, right? And then on top of that, it just makes me skeptical that there's goodness, that you can actually get a fair shake, because even when it appears like you're getting a fair shake, it's tainted by all of this like BS.
It's a good point. It's a great point.
So this was what I like. This is what I was walking into as somebody who was 16, right? And so then on top of that, every day when I worked in car pickup, and then when I worked for IGA for 7 years. So I went through car pickup. I became one of the first male cashiers to ever work at the grocery stores. I ended up working the post office. Like it just was like I was from there. I was there from grade 11 until I finished law school.
Mm.
And so what I recognize is that it was very seldom that, first of all, people would say crazy racist shit to you all the time. All the time. They would
Yes.
accuse you of stealing. You stole my 25-cent coupon. And then of course it went from that to, you know, people coming into the store drunk on a Saturday night and just calling you the N-word to your face, and you having to figure out some strategy socially to deal with that. And so to me, you know, in terms of equity, I feel like all of my ideas around equity and what I saw as being inequities and how we're treated and how to hopefully use my life. If I can't change the world, use my life to change the world of the people who I touch. That's really where all of that was forged. Right.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was like, I mean, it's awful, right? Like, I mean, I remember when the woman from the deli department came out to talk to me about the fact that I was the first to be hired. And she said to me, don't F up, because there will never be another one hired again.
It's a lot
And
of
I
pressure.
took that to heart. Yeah, no question. Tons of pressure. But of course, that's also been my entire career, right? Of always being the first one and having to kind of like make sure that I perform so that there's space left for somebody else who comes after me.
Yeah, and that's a great conversation around community that is unique and hasn't really come up so far in the podcast, which I appreciate you bringing up the realism of growing up in Nova Scotia, because as you know, one of our connections is Rocky Jones, who was a
Yep.
civil rights lawyer, and my mom, Joan Jones. So think about, me growing up and needing to leave the house because there's a bomb threat on Kennard that, they're going to
Wow.
burn down our house. Death threats towards my mom. And also that same burden of being the first. I kind of went through that as well, and I think I really appreciate the realness that it's not fun, it's not easy. But you feel a responsibility, even a community responsibility, that you have to hold that down so you can open up the space for the next person. But being the first one in is like almost in the war, like you're the first person, foot soldier that goes in, right? So you're going to take a lot of knocks because you're the first person in, and so I think that there's a connection there around. Okay, so how can you take? And this is what I've done, Floyd. Is how can I take what happened to me and two things: make room for community and give those same skills. It's almost like Annecy skills, right? Like Annecy the folktale. Like you have to outcraft
Yeah.
people. Like that, I learned that from small. But then the other thing is speak truth to power. Like that, after a certain point, I was just saying, I'm telling these stories so that and white people and people who are in the majority in Nova Scotia know that I know that they know. So
Mm-hmm.
as you get to
Mm-hmm.
university, and now you're a young man, um, and you've had these experiences, what was going through your mind as you went through St. Mary's and then you go to Dow Law School? What were you? And I know that you ended up going to Toronto to start your articling and was called to the bar in Ontario. Was that your path? Like, was law what you thought you were going to do?
Um, Here's the deal. Um, I actually, when I went to St. Mary's, I started as a commerce uh, major. Um, I had a play produced when I was 19 in the community at the Black Culture Center, and I decided to change my major to English. I decided I was either going to be a teacher and I would go on and get my master's and my PhD in English and be a professor and write for screenplays during my summers. That was my plan. Or I would become a lawyer become an entertainment lawyer, and then write, and then eventually be able to be put in a position to write full time. The plan B ended up becoming the plan A. And, I just kind of, that was just, it just worked out that way. I was very lucky in terms of the people who I met along the way. I like to bring it back to community. I had really great community.
Yes.
I had people who taught me a great deal about just how to live and how to walk through the world. One of the things that, for better or worse, my way of living has always been, and this is something that comes from the grocery store. I decided that it doesn't matter what some stranger thinks about me or says about me. At the end of the day, that person doesn't matter. The people who matter, your community, are the people who matter. Your friends and family are the people who matter. And so one of the things for me is that when I have community, I choose the people who are part of my community very carefully. Because those are the people whose opinions I care about, whose advice I care about, who, I think I have friends who they've been my friends since junior high school.
Yes.
And they've been my best friends. And there are times when we don't talk for months on end. And we just start over like we just never, like it never ended. Like it's an unbroken chain. And for me, like, I think that's it's a strategy that, like, I think one of the things that we, racism and like equity issues, for me, the way that you combat everything is by being successful.
I agree.
Like, yeah. Because once you're successful, it's like, yes, people can come at you, but they have to understand that if you're successful, they can't take away your success. Like, you were asking me about whether or not my plan was fully by design. No, my design was not to leave Nova Scotia. I love Nova Scotia. Despite all of my issues with the province, with respect to racism and whatnot, I love Nova Scotia. However, and I'll tell you what happened. I was in my second year of law school, and when as your dad probably knows, or probably would have told you, when you go to law school, they do this whole match thing.
Yes.
And I don't know if Rocky went through it, because I know Rocky wanted to do his own thing, but there's this whole match thing and they have these Saturdays that they call Super Saturday or whatever, where you meet with all the law firms that come to the law school, and they all interview you and you talk shit, whatever. So what happened is, the Toronto firms came down. I was there, did the networking thing with them. One of the firms took a great interest in me, just because one of the partners, she'd grown up economically disadvantaged as well, so she kind of vibed with me on that level. And then the Nova Scotia firms were coming to the law school, and I was particularly interested in Patterson Kitts, because they represented Bank of Montreal. They had an entertainment practice, because I think Chip Sutherland, I want to say, I know I'm getting his name wrong, but he was like a big music guy he was a music promoter who bought all the concerts to Halifax. And I think he was one of their partners or an associate there. And so anyway, I I really wanted to article at that firm because I was interested in entertainment law.
Yes.
And so the Saturday that they were supposed to have the Super Saturday event, I had to go to Ottawa because I was working with the Black Law Students Association of Canada at the time,
Yes.
and
Yes.
they were having a thing.
Yes.
So I come back. So I call the firm. I let them know I'm not going to be able to be there, but I'd love to meet with them because I really would love to article with them. I uh, I arrive back to Nova Scotia. I go for the interview. The interview is great, really great. I get back to the law school, and a couple days later, Carol Aylward, who was the director at the time, she calls me into her office, and she proceeds to tell me that she got a call because someone from Patterson-Kitsap called her complaining about the fact that there was a Black male law student, and there were very few of us who had come down and interviewed with them, and they didn't come to the Super Saturday event, and they didn't have the pamphlet on the firm or know anything about the firm, or blah 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 blah, and then these kids wonder why they don't get jobs. So that
Mm.
was the whole. So that was the whole thing, right? And meanwhile, in my back pocket, I had the job offer from Blake's in Toronto, which was the second largest law firm in the country at the time. So, so despite all of that, Patterson-Kitsap came back and offered me an articling position, and I respectfully declined.
Yeah.
Because for me, it just was like, why? Why would I choose this over this law firm in Toronto where they basically have said, we want you, we like you. There's no, am I allowed to swear?
Go ahead.
There's no bullshit, and you can just like I can just go and I can get like a great set of articles. I can have this on my resume that I've worked for this firm, and I'll do my bar in Ontario. And if I come back to Nova Scotia and I need to, I'll do it in Nova Scotia. It was a very, like, for me, it was a very disheartening experience because, like I said, I really wanted to stay in Nova Scotia.
Yes.
Um, but that kind of, set my departure in motion.
What I just appreciate, the space and you telling your story, Floyd, because at this point, obviously you've got this great light shining on Floyd Kane, but yet, I really appreciate the community conversation, and I feel your love hate for Nova Scotia, and I will say that because there's things about it that I really don't like, as far as the minority situation and the way that the racism that exists here. It's a fact. We live it. It's a fact. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
also from Nova Scotia. I'm Scotian. I love that we are R&B. I love that we are a little bit country. I love that, there's a lot of things about it I love. But I would also say that what speaks to me is as I started to get older, similar to you, I was making decisions around what I wanted to do based on authenticity of the offer, right? Whether it was where I went to university, what job I took. I mean, I spent 10 years teaching in the Caribbean, and I went there for authenticity because I didn't want to be a minority anymore. So I went to a
Mm-hmm.
place where it was a majority. There was an authentic feel that I needed in my soul, right? And I
Yeah.
think that kind of speaks to you being in Toronto and being in that space where you can get the entertainment law, you can get the people that value what you bring to the table, but there's an authenticity that we often have to go towards. And I would even say last thing, and I don't want to talk too long, but I now do a lot of equity, diversity, and inclusion work with companies, and I will tell certain companies I'm not doing the work because it's not authentic. You feel a George Floyd guilt, and you want someone to come in, and I'm not going to do that, right? So that authentic piece is there. So I do want to move us along. So we'll talk about you start to now in Toronto get some experience writing, right? And you're
Yeah.
starting to get those connections. And that's so you come back and you're with Halifax Films in 2004, right? So there's a kind of a return to Halifax, and to some writing for CBC and stuff like that. Is that when you start to feel momentum like this, writing for television, writing for movies, writing docs? This is my thing.
No, to be honest, no. So what happened? So I came back in 1998 because the NDP had become the official opposition, and Yvonne Atwell had been elected as the first Black female MLA, and I went to work as a researcher for them. Yvonne essentially got me the job,
Yes.
and I worked with them for a year. We went through that was probably one of the most tumultuous elections Nova Scotia had ever had. It was terrible. I hated the job. When we lost a bunch of seats, they had to get rid of 2 researchers, and I essentially volunteered to go. But as I was leaving, I ended up being hired by Salter Street Films as legal counsel, and I worked with them for about 2 years, and then they were purchased by Alliance Atlantis, and then I stayed for another year, and then Michael Donovan and Charles Bishop started a new company called Halifax Film Company. I ended up going to work with them, and I was one of the founding shareholders of that company. That company then went on to become DHX Media, and now it's called Wildbrain. I had left, and it wasn't until, I would say, and being honest, I was writing the whole time that I was working at that company. Like, I was writing after work. But at a certain point within that company, I realized my career is never going to take off. Like, I had opportunities where I did a show called North South about the construction industry in Nova Scotia, which was a 7-part drama series. I did a 6-part drama series called Soul that I executive produced. It was created by Andy Marshall, and Peter Louderman was the showrunner on that. But it wasn't until I actually decided to leave DHX, which was in, I think, almost 9 years ago, that I actually, even though I spent, and I didn't work all the time. Like, I left the company. I got 1 gig as a writer working on the show Continuum. I then ended up spending 3 years not really working or making any money other than just honing my craft as a writer. And then eventually Amos Atatui asked me to produce a movie with him and called Torchbearer. That movie fell apart. We had some development money left over. We were going to give it back to Telefilm, and Stephanie Azam, who was the Telefilm person at the time, she said, "Is there something else you want to work on?" And that led to me writing Across the Line, which, and to me, that is a moment that everything just took off. The moment we did Across the Line.
2014.
2014. Yeah. That's right.
Wow. And I love the questions because you're filling in. Obviously, it's a podcast interview. You're filling in. No, but this is for people too, to see that it wasn't easy. It wasn't linear. And I remember, actually, I ran into Yvonne a couple of days ago. She was at a basketball gym watching her grandson play, right? And so, and we know that community-wise, Yvonne holds a lot of, she's an elder in the community and still does that work. Is. So, and I didn't know that you had been involved with that political side. And so I do want to get to, because Across the Line was you got accolades for that. How did we get to, because we got to get to Diggstown. Like, how did that bubble up?
Across the Line?
Well, no, Diggstown. So, or even what's your transition from, because obviously Across the Line gave you another spotlight, right?
Yeah.
But and you said right then I got my momentum. Just to explain the beginnings of, even, were you writing Diggstown before you had the chance, or did they come to you and you started to write it? Like, how did the idea come, and then how did it come to fruition?
So for the last few years, like after Across the Line, I'd spent quite a bit of time trying to do. I wanted to do something involving a black person working as either a cop or a lawyer in Halifax. And so I developed a show about a black male detective working in the North End and having an ex-wife who was like who was a prosecutor who had ties to the South End. And so like then I worked on something where it was about a black female cop who was undercover, who was returning to Nova Scotia to her family. So a lot of this was bubbling because I mean, for me, like one of the big issues is that it's very seldom that we see authentic portrayals of Black Nova Scotians on Canadian
Yes.
television. So
Yes.
so so that's been something I'm very interested in. So then, my producing partner, Amos Sadatui, who to this day we're still partners, he called me and he was like, I think CBC would be interested in doing a legal drama. And so then I started thinking about, well, how can I take these characters who I've developed in these cop shows and move them into a legal procedural, and what would be interesting for me as a legal procedural. And so I called a few people who I know who work in legal aid. And I was like, so what does that look like? What's your day look like? How does that work? And so after talking to them, I was like, okay, well, this could be an interesting world to
Yes.
think about, because it's very seldom that we see portrayals on television where lawyers are representing people who are poor or like economically disadvantaged, right? Usually when you see shows, people tend to look middle class, upper middle class,
Yes.
and so I really wanted to kind of take a look at what that world was. But I also had this whole idea of, it's interesting to think about how when you are poor, how a small charge can completely disrupt your life.
Yes.
And I thought, and that was something that I never really saw on television. And that was why we initially, our first case was to do like a drunk driving case, because it seems like such a simple thing. But it's like, if you drive a truck for a living, then that means you can't work if you lose your license. And if you're in the middle of a divorce, which was what my uh, character was, and you're dealing with a dispute with a former spouse over your children, then the fact that you're not making any money becomes a problem as well. So there are just all these this tiny little legal case, though this charge can have these massive reverberations for your life. And that was where the show really started for me, in terms of thinking about, yeah, it'd be really great to do a show like Diggstown, where you have characters dealing, like where you have Marcy and the other legal aid lawyers defending clients who are dealing with these types of issues and the reverberations for their lives.
Yeah, and and congratulations on the show, Floyd, because you deal with that so well, but you also deal with it. And if you're from Nova Scotia, Jojo Carvery, we know the names. We know the
Mm.
Diggs name. That's an East Preston name. That's
Yeah.
and so there's that familiarity. But I do, and many people love the content, Floyd, because it's interesting when I go back over our time together just now, and I think about you at IGA and you at Cole Harbour and you at Bell Park, and there's a sense where you can now get those things off your chest, right? In a drama, like in a situational drama, where I see there's a real authenticity to some of the stories that you're bringing out. Because obviously my dad, worked. He didn't do legal aid, but he defended people that didn't have money, like he did, and that's a different type of law. That's a different,
Yeah.
yeah. Go ahead.
Your dad. I mean, you probably don't know this, but years ago, I mean, I wanted to make your dad's story into a movie. And he and I had spent time talking about that, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to do a mini series based on the whole situation with him and Derek and the cops
St.
suing. And
Pat's in St. Pat's Junior
yeah,
High School.
exactly that whole case. And um I'm not gonna, I will tell you off the record, but someone decided they didn't want to participate at the last minute, and so we weren't able to do it. But to me, like, that's one of the greatest stories, untold stories ever, because it's this not it's so fascinating to think about how the legal establishment align themselves against your father in this situation, right? It just was like, it's a brilliant situation about, you know, someone who has been fighting against the system his entire life, and the system coming after him,
Yeah,
like, and these
because in
people.
speaking truth to power, because that
Yeah,
example, and we won't get into it on this podcast, but it was an example of calling it what it was. And that
yeah.
led to hundreds of thousands of dollars being put down and from the bar and from this and judges and when you just saw it. And the funny thing is, and you knew my dad on certain levels, and I know my dad is so not what people made him out to be. Like if you wanted to
Mm.
demonize him, you could, but the fact is that um he was about fairness and equality, and he wasn't afraid to call stuff out. And it was easy for him to do that when he wasn't a lawyer, right? When he was a civil rights activist, he was blowing stuff up and just saying whatever. If you didn't like him, you didn't like him. But when he became a lawyer, that story that you're talking about in particular, um, like they tried to constrain him within the job,
Hmm.
right? And make him pay for speaking that same truth. And hopefully it
Yeah.
opened up some space for other people to speak truth, to say that, yes, we think about the street check thing now. Like he was just saying that what happened that day with cops that weren't even there for that particular incident was racist. And they wouldn't have done
Hmm.
it to a white child. And that led to that long battle over just saying that they wouldn't have done that to a white child.
No, it's crazy. It's crazy.
So, how do you feel? I mean, with some of the feedback that you're getting now, and is there some sense? And you said, it's nice to be in a position where now you have power, you have a name, and people are almost paying attention to your every word, but yet your voice speaks through a hard hitting, down to earth, surfing, you know, legal aid lawyer that bounces back and forth, female powerhouse. Do you, like how? Obviously, this is a rhetorical question, but how do you feel now about this thing that you built called Diggstown?
I love Diggstown. I think it's I for me, like, it's a show that I love what we do and the space that we fill in terms of the Canadian television landscape. I love the fact that we're not afraid to talk about things that are uncomfortable for Canadians to kind of give some thought to. Um, I for me, after the whole thing with George Floyd happened, and listening to so many people say, well, I didn't know this and I never understood this. And it's like, well, wait a second. You're like someone who grew up in the 60s and 70s, and you don't know. That just felt in a lot of ways, it felt disingenuous to me. And so, you know, part of the show is about, talking about these things that happen in Canadian society, um, and having people and putting people in a position to not be able to say I don't know anymore.
Yeah, yeah,
Because we're telling you it does happen, it does exist in our country, in your own backyard, and you have to embrace that. Um, but the other thing I will say is, in truth, like, I don't think I don't think of myself as being powerful. I think of myself as being like, right now I have a platform, and which is Diggstown, and I can use that platform to try and, you know, express to people what, in a lot of ways, how I feel about the world, or to show people kind of the world that I live in.
Yeah.
Um, but tomorrow, if Digstown ends, I mean, it ends, and I move on to the next show, and I go back to hustling, just like every other writer.
Of
So
course.
so to me, like, yeah, I just, like, right now, I'm really grateful to have had the 3 seasons so far, and hopefully we'll get a fourth, to be able to tell these stories, and to bring, like, Marcy, and bring Nova Scotia in both its, like, beauty and ugliness to, to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I do want to thank you again, Floyd, for that, because when I watch the show, I'm so proud, and I'm saying that honestly as a Nova Scotian. Like, I'm seeing places, and I'm here with my wife who's from Hamilton, and we're talking. Hey, that's where we. And that's like, when have we ever been able to do that? I mean, so much, especially lawyer drama. If it's Canadian, it's coming out of Vancouver. It's coming out of Toronto, especially, right?
Yeah,
And so to tell that Nova Scotian story, because we have many people here in Canada that don't understand Nova Scotia. They really don't, right?
100%.
And so you've opened that up, and I do want to make a shameless plug for the last episode that I watched. You had one of the people I had on the podcast, Kate McDonald, was acting right as the police officer
Yeah.
who lived in PEI, right? And so I kind of saw it. I laughed at I knew you were coming on. I said, wow, that's a nice connection. The last thing I really want to really again, and I'm so happy to have you here and tell you how much I admire what you do. But our other connection is the scholarship at St. Mary's, Edna and Velma Thomas Kane Writers Award. There's, you've established that around supporting and giving back, but you put some beautiful parameters around how that scholarship looks. Explain a little bit about the scholarship and how it came to be with you working with St. Mary's.
Sure. I've taken a deep breath, just because the two women it's named after, my late Aunt Velma and my mother, are extremely instrumental in where I am in my journey.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my reason for wanting to do it, I mean, it has to do with what I talked about earlier, in terms of like, working on across the line, and hearing the statistics about Black Nova Scotians who have been multi-generational Nova Scotians, in terms of whether or not they choose to go to university. And I guess my feeling was really, when I started Diggstown, one of the things I really wanted to do was encourage more. I wanted to find Black Nova Scotians who I could bring into the writing room, and maybe shepherd them and help them come up through the process. And when I initially tried looking for people in Nova Scotia during season 1, there wasn't anybody, or so I was told. There wasn't anybody. So then what happened is, in season 2, we looked again, and we actually had, like, we participated formally with, like, the Screen Nova Scotia, in their whole writing program, where you can come into a series and mentor in the writing room for a couple of weeks. And none of their applicants were Black Nova Scotians at the time. So I just kind of, this third season, we got lucky, because we actually were able to get Kumbi, who, she had sent a script to me to read for a feature film, just unrelated to Diggstown. And I had said to her, I said, well, hey, do you want to come and, be my show running assistant for the season of Diggstown? For personal reasons, she couldn't do that. But I said, well, how about coming into the writing room for a few weeks anyway? at least you'll get some experience, and you
Yeah.
can tell people you like, you can put it on your resume. And so that, like, so I always wanted to kind of have that happen, but it wasn't happening fast enough and in the way I wanted it to. So what I decided was I wanted to create, well, let me go back. The other thing that happened is I have two nephews who both went to SMU. They're both like 10 years out of university. They both still have massive student loan debt.
Yes.
So I paid it off because I could. I'm not, I mean, you don't know me, but I'm not somebody who is, I have two things that I like: eating at a nice restaurant, and I like a nice bottle of wine. That's it.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not a big spender. So I'm relatively cheap. So for me, it was like, okay, I can afford to do this, so I'm going to help them out.
Yes.
And so from that, I thought to myself, think about the number of Black Nova Scotian students who, when they think about going to university, they stop thinking about university as an option, not because they don't want to go to university, because they're thinking about the massive debt load they'll leave when they come out of university, that they'll have hanging over their head.
Yes.
And for me, I was like, okay, because I understand, right? Like, I was from that perspective of, I didn't have a parent or a relative who I could call and say, hey, can you lend me $1,000 to do X, Y, and Z? Can you lend me $100 to do X, Y, and Z? I didn't have that. I didn't grow up with that. So I understood that as a reality for a lot of Black Nova Scotian kids who are thinking about university. And so right out of the gate, when you're thinking about that, you go, okay, well, maybe university is not for me. Maybe I'll get a trade. And listen, I mean, and just to say this, like, there's nothing wrong with getting a trade. University is not for everybody. If you want to, I mean, frankly, as an old friend of mine said, if you want to be a garbage man, you can be the best garbage. Just be the best garbage man you can be. Be passionate about it. It doesn't matter. But if you want to go to university, what I wanted to do was remove money as an obstacle. What I wanted to do was give people an opportunity who decide to go to university to know that at the end, when you're finished your undergrad degree, if you want to continue, or you want to pay off your debt, or you want to travel for like 2 years, or you want to go do some writing fellowship in the States or Australia, wherever, there's an opportunity for you. It's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's there waiting for you. And that was why I created the scholarship. It's not a scholarship, it's a prize, because essentially at graduation, you apply. If you're the successful person, someone hands you a check for $30,000. You do what you want to do with it, right? And that, to me, like, if I would have had something like that when I was an undergrad, if I knew that this existed when I was in high school, I would have totally I would have made sure I was going to university, because I don't have to worry about the money. I can go, oh, well, I could win this, And so that was the reason why I created it, and the reason I put the parameters around it in terms of like it being Black Nova Scotians is because, I mean, that's, to me, like, once again, I want to see those numbers go up, right? I want to see more Black men, more Black women choosing to go to university, if they want to, right? Once again, it's about giving people choice, and not making everything about economics.
No, well, it's beautiful and it's brilliant. I read the parameters for it, and I also sit on the selection committee, and I thought, when we were going through it, I thought it was such a different way to look at it, because what blew my mind is when he said, when you get the money, we're not checking back on you. And there's something very systemic and I'll say Eurocentric around, we need to know how you spent every penny, right? And so I thought when we were going through it, I just thought, wow, you really opened up a beautiful space, Floyd. It's a brilliant way to give back to the community. And when we think about student loans and getting a prize at the end when you graduate to say, whew, all this pressure's off me and I can be in a creative space, right? I think that's brilliant. And I just want to, again, thank you for the work that you do. I want to thank you for the beautiful platform, which is Diggstown. The work that you're doing, Floyd, and sharing your time with me today. I really got to know more about you, and obviously the people that listen to the podcast will get to know more about you. And I really, really appreciate your time, and it's been a pleasure talking to you, sir.
No problem. Thank you so much, Augy. This was really great.
Thanks for watching this episode of Empathize Others, the podcast. We hope that you really enjoyed the show. If you're enjoying the podcast series overall, as much as we enjoy making it, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps our channel grow, and when you subscribe, you'll know right away when our new episodes are released.